Hey folks, welcome to part 2 of our end-to-end with a custom OAuth server lecture. Our first part focused on putting together a basic solution with a Xamarin iOS app, a web API app, and a website, all sharing the same backend. In this second part, we're going to look at adding authentication to our entire solution by hosting an OAuth server on our website using the open source Identity Server 3. I should first point out that we use a very naive solution in this demo. If you plan to host your own production implementation, plan to spend weeks learning all the ins and outs and deciding what's best for your situation. In fact, if you're simply looking for the easiest way to add a shared authentication infrastructure to your ASP.NET website and mobile app, I would highly recommend you look into using Microsoft Azure Authentication. Or you can always look at using social login providers like Facebook or Twitter directly. With all that said, if you're still looking to host your own OAuth provider, hopefully this lecture will help. You can find the files I reference in the lecture as well as the completed solution on GitHub at the URL displayed. Let's get started.
Alright guys, so we've got our 3 different projects, well 4 kind of. We've got these different projects all talking together, all working together with the same data, but really no security. No security other than what the website has for itself. It's not really sharing that security at all. The web API doesn't care about security. The mobile app doesn't care about security. So we need to fix that. We need to first of all secure the data through the web API. Then web API needs to be able to authenticate to something to make sure that our user has permission. And of course the mobile app needs to be able to provide that permission. So what we need, since we're already doing our authentication and authorization through our website, what we need to do is then tack on an authorization server, a server that explicitly is built to provide a token, provide authentication, and be able to share that through that token. All right, this is a huge topic. Authorization server, what is it? Well, we're going to be using OAuth and beyond that even OpenID Connect. And what are those things? This is a huge topic, and we have some classes to help us get up to speed on that. We have ENT 170, 171, 172. Even those are going to largely just scratch the surface of this very large topic. And if you truly need enterprise level security, you need to dive a lot deeper. We're going to help you. We're going to kickstart you here with both those classes and what we're about to do in this class. Right? So what we're going to do is use a product called Identity Server. This is open source, and you can go and access the source, or you can just pull it down with Nuget. But we're going to use this product, Identity Server, in order to tack on that additional feature functionality to our website. Our website's already using ASP.NET Identity, and Identity Server can actually integrate with ASP.NET Identity. Now, the identity name is mostly just coincidence because Identity Server can actually integrate with other products as well, other ways of doing authentication as well. And Identity Server itself just handles that OAuth OpenID Connect server side of things. It doesn't necessarily need to worry about the actual how we define roles, how we define users, how we create users. It integrates nicely with our ASP.NET Identity backend or potentially other backends. So if you guys are going to be using Identity Server in a production environment, head over to their website. They've got a ton of documentation, really excellent documentation, really excellent samples, and there's a lot. You can go really deep on this product. We are going to be using the absolute most simple configuration possible for our project here today. So remember, if you really want to do this in a real-world production environment, in order to be able to use authentication with your mobile apps, your APIs, or have other websites even authenticate against your authorization server, remember you're going to want to dive a lot deeper into the documentation than what we actually do today. Furthermore, you don't necessarily always need your own authorization server. We have Azure Authorization Server. That's an OAuth authorization server. For some things, you may not even need that. You may just be able to go directly to Google or Facebook and do an OAuth there just to integrate with their security. just to get that user's Facebook identity, for instance, in which case you really don't need your own backend server controlling the OAuth situation. Okay, all that said though, let's get back to our scenario. And in our scenario, we've already got a website that has a bunch of data. We have security in that website, and now we want our mobile app and our API to be able to access that same data, right? But do it in a properly authenticated and authorized way. So the first thing we're going to do is go get Identity Server. For this, we can use the Nuget package. So we'll find a lot of options for Identity Server, but I'm most interested in the ASP.NET Identity specific one. Still a lot of options here, right? And there we go. Agree to the license. Now, what we're going to want to do after we clear these windows out of our way, we're going to want to go back to our startup.auth. So back in app start here, I showed you guys this earlier, our startup.auth. This is where Owen is configuring the pipeline. That's O-W-I-N, Owen. That configures our pipeline for execution of our ASP.NET requests. And so it's going to go through the pipeline that is defined in this dependency injection sort of framework. And it turns out we can actually define kind of a sub pipeline, if you will, or just use a path. We can actually define a path to give ourselves a separate pipeline from the main one. And that's actually what we're going to do in order to use Identity Server. We're going to have requests that go to that particular path, go along a different pipeline, and execute different code. Slightly different code that's going to result in us getting a token. All right, and that token, of course, is then what my mobile app can hold on to be treated as the user, so that my mobile app has some way to prove it has the user working on its behalf. And again, if you're not familiar with how that's going to work and what a token is, highly recommend. We have an OAuth Lightning lecture. We have those ENT17X classes. Highly recommend those. All right, so let's start getting started on what we need to do to define the particular path for our authorization. I'm going to go down to the bottom of this configure auth section here. At least sort of the bottom. We'll ignore the stuff down here for now. And I'm going to define app.map, and here I'm just going to give it a separate path. This is where requests to the authorization server, so for things like tokens, will go to. And when they go in that direction, we are going to be executing the following pipeline. So we'll just give this lambda to configure that pipeline. If we notice, this auth that I just gave is an IApp builder. And that's actually the same thing that this is right here. So the app class on the outside, or the app instance here on the outside, this is for configuring the global settings, right? And so globally, for the rest of the website, we're going to be using cookie authentication, we're going to be using this database context, we're going to be using this user manager. That's all configured. So now in here, we're going to configure things that are specific to this path, but it uses the exact same syntax, as you can see, an IApp builder. So we can do the exact same sorts of things. In this case, of course, we're going to be working with Identity Server and doing some of its sorts of things rather than the sorts of things that were done up here, although there will be a lot of similarity. And the first thing I'm going to do is set up an Identity Server factory. So let's do that. new service factory. We're going to need a using for that. Then we'll start to set up some properties of this. I want to say use in-memory clients. So what does that really mean when I say use in-memory clients here? Well, I have to authenticate clients. Remember, clients are things like my mobile device itself, or like my mobile app itself, or maybe some other website that wants to authenticate against my website. The clients are the other applications. And so I'm going to have a list of applications that are allowed. And I'm just using an in-memory list in this case is what this is. Identity Server also allows me to configure a service that could look up clients as needed. But obviously the simplest configuration is just to create a list, keep it in memory, and that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to do this in just a second. I'll for right now just throw a get clients method in here, and let's go ahead and create the stub for that. So we should have our stub down here. Good. Next, I'm going to do the same thing with scopes. Okay, so use in-memory scopes, and we'll do get scopes. So what are scopes? Scopes are kind of like permission sets. And if you think about accessing data and you think about wanting to access a certain amount of data, right? The scope of what you need access to, right? How much do you need access to? That's what a scope is. So it's almost sort of like a role, though not really. A scope really refers to what things do you need access to. Oh, I need access to all of the customer stuff. Or, oh, I need access to all of the accounting stuff. Or I just need access to your website, right? So a scope defines the type of access, especially when we talk about the type of scopes we're going to be talking about right now, which is a resource scope. There are also identity scopes, which we won't get into. Let's go ahead and create our stub for now. So the next thing we're going to do with our factory is actually recreate some of the pipeline that is used above, but we're going to have to do it in a unique way. First of all, why do we have to recreate the pipeline? Well, the reason is because Identity Server is also going to use ASP.NET Identity. Remember, it's going to actually talk to the backend, talk to ASP.NET Identity, and use its entity framework and its user tables and its role tables and all that good stuff. And so it needs to be configured to also use ASP.NET Identity. Though there are some slight settings differences that we're going to have to take into account. We do have a helper method that was actually our helper class that was actually added to our project when we added our Nuget. And that's actually in here in our app packages. So in addition to some references, we actually did get, as part of that Nuget, we actually did get this source file right here, which is our ASP.NET Identity helper. ASP.NET Identity User Service. So that's one of the things that's going to help us out. And you can see that this is going to do a lot of logic that's going to convert things from the grammar of ASP.NET Identity into the grammar of Identity Server. So that's what we have to set up next. Let's grab my Identity Server factory here. We're going to actually close this particular variable. We could continue, I suppose, to do this fluently, but this will be a little bit more readable. So let's set up my user service. This is really just a registration to the service locator / dependency injector type framework. We just have a user service one that actually gets its own hard-coded property, but it's still just going to use a registration. So new registration, as you can see, of iUser service, which is what we want. Though I don't actually want all that namespace in there. So let's just get a using statement in here. That's going to be more readable. And then what I want is when you go looking for an iUser service here, I want it to resolve to my ASP.NET Identity User Service. And then we have a couple generic arguments that go in there. The user service is going to be for application user. That's a class that was created by ASP.NET Identity or created for ASP.NET Identity when we created our new website. So that was an automatically created class for us, part of our template when we did file new. We'll go take a look at that here shortly because we do actually care about the implementation of that. And string refers to the key. So the user ID is a string key. And then register is a new registration is a constructor, so we want our parens there. And so now we've got that registration. Let's give ourselves a little bit of room here to actually see some code. There we go. That'll give us a little bit more room to work with here. So we can see we've now registered when we go looking for an iUser service. Let's resolve it with an ASP.NET Identity User Service, which is that thing that we got here. Now, that will actually have some dependencies that we need to in turn resolve. So that will go looking, for instance, for my application user manager. All right, so I will actually it goes looking for a user manager of T. And the T in this case is application user. It knows that because I registered that there. So when it goes looking for that user manager, I'll have to tell it that my custom application user manager is what it should use. Now, my application user manager is custom, though it too was created by the template when we file newed, when we new solutioned this project. So we're going to go looking for a user manager of application user with key of string. That's what it's going to go looking for. We have a particular implementation of that, and that is our application user manager. So let's go ahead and check out my application user manager to see what I mean, to see that it is a user manager of application user of string. Let's just go ahead and hit our F12 to follow that. And there we have it. User manager is an application user. And if we actually follow that further, we'll see that string is the default for the second T there. So let's go back for right now. Whoops, we're missing a caret over here. Let's go ahead and close out those. And now we have to go to another step because our application user manager in turn is going to be using a user store. An iUser store is what it requires. Okay, so we have to actually register that as well. By the way, I'm doing this all in line right here just to put it all into our startup.auth, and maybe some of these lines are a little long and ugly. Certainly if you want to rearrange this to make it cleaner code like some of the identity server samples in their sample code does, by all means do that. I'm just trying to keep it all together right here so we can kind of see it and understand what we're doing getting these registrations together. So we need an iUser store. That's something my application user manager relies on. So my iUser store is also of application user. Now for this one, I'm actually using a resolver. So I've got this resolver here that I'm going to say when you go looking for an iUser store, what I want to have is it's going to actually use the resolver is going to be the same IOC container, if you will, that will be able to look up these other things later. Well, I can actually use it right now inside this method to say, hey, when you go looking for an iUser store, I want you to do it like so. Execute the new user store of application user not iUser store, that should be new user store of application user, passing into its constructor resolver, right, that was passed in here, dot resolve db context. So again, what I'm saying here is when my user manager goes looking for an iUser store, it's going to ask the dependency injection framework here where it should get an iUser. And so now I'm registering it to say when someone goes looking for an iUser of application user, return them whatever this method, I'm giving them this method and say return whatever this method returns. And of course what this method returns is a new instance of user store constructed this way. And of course, once again, I have mismatched braces, so let's get another parent in there. And then my user store is actually defined right here in the identity framework or entity framework. And so now we can say, all right, when you need an iUser store, create a user store of application user with the identity context that you can get from the same context, from the same container, which of course we haven't registered yet, so let me actually do that now. And I have an application DB context, which is the good old context created for my entity framework interaction. Now we have all of the setup necessary to wire together the application user and the application user manager that knows how to go and get my users and construct my users. All right, so this is basically these same things are registered largely up here, although we see that application user manager here takes advantage of a create method. Okay, and this and the application DB context does as well. And these short circuit some of the need to do all this very explicitly like that. They do it for this setup. Unfortunately, we're unable to take advantage of this because this makes certain assumptions that we can't make. So, though the create method won't work for us, so we just do it here. We just register everything explicitly and let the dependency injection framework do its thing for us. We will have to make a little bit of a tweak to my application user manager at this point. So once again, I'm going to F12 over to its definition. By the way, so this is identity config. Actually, let's not even use F12. Let me show you where that is. So our identity config also created just as part of our template when we selected to create a website that used ASP.NET Identity. Right? So the identity config is over here. Right there, and that created a lot of the stuff that I've told you was created by the template. We can see a lot of this is right in here. Okay, there's my application user manager deriving from user manager for an application user. Application user, of course, then is our specific application, and I can F12 into that as well. We can see that derives from identity user, which is part of our whole identity framework thing. And so the customization that I need to make here is that I actually need to set up my application user manager to use OpenID Connect compliant claims. So claims are going to be the things that will be embedded into the token that say who the user is. Basically, you can think of a claim as saying, I claim to be the user with this email address. I claim to be the user with this first name and last name. I claim to have the role of administrator. You can think of claims that way, but there are certain standards. And ASP.NET has some of its own that are the defaults here. We actually want to use some OpenID Connect defaults, and so that's what we're going to do at this point, is modify the application user manager so that it creates the standardized claim types. So we have a claims identity factory in there, and we're going to set it equal to a new claims identity factory for application user, of course, once again. of string. And then we're going to set those special properties. The user ID claim type is going to be identity server3.core claim types dot subject. So that's where our user ID will go. Our username will be in preferred username, and our roles will be under role. Now, because our anti-forgery part of ASP.NET actually uses some of the default claim types, we actually now need to tweak that a little bit and say, hey, all of our anti-forgery tokens, and this is actually a static, so let's see if we can get that using to show up here. There we go. This is just a static class, and it has the unique claim type identifier that we can set. And so at the same time I'm setting these, I'm going to go ahead and set that global static. And that will also be set to the subject. And so this is just where the anti-forging system should get the claim that represents the actual user, so the user ID, right? And so that's where it's getting it. We're now done with our user manager customizations, but we're not done over here yet. There's a lot to do. This is definitely the hardest part of this setup, is getting all of the identity server stuff done. And actually, in a real world situation, you should plan on taking days at least to figure out the right way and how it fits into your overall infrastructure. Okay, this is definitely the most complicated, serious part. So the fact that it's taking us, a half hour or so to do it here should by no means seem like it's really a long time for this. It should actually take days to really do it. So we've got that factory. Now we're going to use the factory that we've been setting up in setting up our options. So set up our var options. And so we'll set up our site name in here, website with securities. That actually needs a new right there. Now our signing certificate, oh boy, this is a toughie. So where do you get a certificate complete with private key? All right, so this is a huge topic all by itself, right? There are a lot of different ways we can handle this. We could, for dev purposes, use makecert. We could actually pull it out of a private repository, pull it out of the operating system, right? There's different APIs for that. There's a ton of different ways we can handle this, and doing it securely in the right way, it could be possibly the same as your SSL certificate. Doing it the right way really, really, really depends on your setup. So we're going to kind of punt, and we're just going to actually borrow code directly from the samples that were included as part of Identity Server. That's just going to load up a PFX file from our working directory. Okay, this is definitely not the right way you would do things, okay? By all means, don't let anyone ever think that I told you that was safe and secure certificate management. But we need a private key, and we need a cert, because the whole idea is our website, our authorization server here, which is one and the same, will be creating these tokens, and they will sign them with the private key. Anyone who has the public key can see we signed that token. Therefore, it is certified by us to be legit. We have to therefore protect our private key. And we have to therefore make sure we're the only ones who can ever sign something with our private key, because it means we certified it. If it's signed with our private key, we have certified it as legitimate, as a real authentication. So let's go ahead and do that copying that we talked about. All right, so we're just going to go add existing item, And I'm just going to go ahead and grab both of those files, my PFX, that's the certificate itself, and the cert class. And my cert class just has a static load method with a hard-coded path to my website with securities.id server 3. And of course it passes a password because yes, this does require a password. We are using a private key, so when I create my X509 certificate, I do need to give it a password. And so now I will just say cert.load. Let's get that semicolon in there so we stop getting the red squigglies, shall we? All right, so for our sanity, next up, we're just going to say require SSL is false. Our factory, can you guess what that is? Yeah, it's going to be that ID server factory that we created up there. And our authentication options for right now will just be empty, but we will actually be doing something interesting with that in a little while. Now I can say auth.use identity server and pass the options, which of course also has the factory. So we have now, with that auth, that part that's part of our ASP.NET infrastructure, told the ASP.NET infrastructure use identity server and all of its configuration. So now ASP.NET is pushing all of our identity server stuff into the pipeline. It's going to have a chance to execute every request, and of course it's going to therefore start issuing tokens and cool stuff like that. Let's go ahead and scroll down now and implement these placeholder methods that I deferred till later, which later is now. So our clients are pretty straightforward. We can implement those by just giving ourselves one sample client. That's going to be our mobile app. All right, so let's do that one first. And our client name will be first. This will be our iOS securities. It's hard to get muscle memory to type made-up words. Muscle memory doesn't like typing made-up words. Our client ID is just going to be iOS. You might want to think about making that more secure or more obscure if you have a lot of real-life clients. Now, we could have a client secret here, especially if we were using our authorization code flow. However, we're not. We're going to keep it simple, and also we're not going to end up having our mobile device, a thick client, require a client secret. Because remember, you can't really keep things too secret if you actually have them installed on your end user's devices. So instead, we'll stick with the implicit flow. Therefore, everybody knows it's not totally secret. It's not totally a secure client, therefore. But that's actually usually okay. The point is, our user authentication is still secure because our users still will have to go through our website in order to actually authenticate. And we want to know what our allowed scopes are. So when this client has users log in, what scopes can those users request when logging in through this client? And this is just another list of string, and these will actually have to correspond with the scopes we create later, but this isn't actually a reference to the scope objects. This actually will just have to correspond these strings with the scope IDs that we do create. Require consent. So do we need that consent screen where the user says that yes, they are willing to let this client have access to their data? We'll say true. Allow remember consent, we'll also say true. Now, redirect URIs. So what is redirect URIs? Well, remember that a lot of times, and really the way our OAuth system is built, it's built to have the client be a website and to be redirecting the user over to our website to log in. And that's what's going to happen. They're going to direct users over to our website to log in to the Auth section, the slash Auth identity server section of our website is where they're going to log in. But then we're going to have to redirect them back. Now, again, OAuth was built with the idea that the clients were also websites, so we would be redirecting them back to a client website. Well, since our client is a mobile app, not a website, we will instead just be redirecting them back to some placeholder URL. And then we'll have to configure our client to just listen for that placeholder URL. The client will open up a web view, and will then just listen for the redirect back to that placeholder URL. So for our placeholder URL, we are just going to use www.xamarin.com. Let's throw our HTTP in there because we need it. And now our client is configured. Our scopes up here will be a new array of scopes. And of course, the name for the one and only scope that we care about for our demo purposes has to be site access, because that's the only one that our client has the ability to request. That's scope type.resource. So scope type.identity would be used for some explicit identity purposes, but we are really just going to use our authentication today to request access to the resources of the data, the customer data that we have. If we were really being strictly compliant with the spec and we're using identity scope types, there's actually a lot more overhead and a lot more very specific requirements about how we have to handle things. And we just want this on our consent screen to be displayed as site access. One more thing we need to do. When we imported our ID server 3 test.pfx file, it probably just inputted as build action content. We actually do need to make this build action embed resource. The reason being that way the code in our cert class works. It uses get manifest resource stream, and so we need that to actually be bundled as a resource in order for that to work. Okay, so just make sure pfx build action embedded resource. All right, and now we're ready to test. Let us set my website as the startup project. And shall we switch over to Microsoft Edge for this test? All right, so far so good. Let's give ourselves a login. And let's check our customers controller. Hey, there's Spacely Sprockets and Cogswell Cogs. Looking good. All right, so while I'm thinking about it, we do have one more thing that would be a good idea to go ahead and do right now. And that's open up our web config and go to our system web modules, actually system web server modules, and we're going to add the run all managed modules for all requests, or ramfar. Set that to true. This is going to prevent ASP.NET from trying to over-optimize. What it tries to do is actually optimize what modules it runs based on file extension and based on path. Well, of course, /auth doesn't exist as a path, so we don't really want it trying to optimize out all the things that we do to /auth. So we're just going to tell it run all managed modules for all requests, so it doesn't try to optimize out that whole /auth. And for now, that'll handle our authorization server setup. Okay, so our next goal here is to modify our mobile app and see if we can use it to go to our authorization server and get an authorization token on behalf of our user. So let us start working in that iOS app, open up our Viewcontroller. And all we're going to do, if we get the token for right now, we're just going to go ahead and display it in that output label. And then we'll work on modifying the web API in order to actually be authenticating, and then we'll hit that API again once it's authenticating. For right now, we just want to see if we can get the token. So I am going to actually comment out our current code. Right there, we'll get rid of some of that space just to give ourselves room to work. And we're going to need to go get our Xamarin Auth component. All right, so we're going to be just doing Xamarin Auth the same way we do it in our ENT172 classes. There should be nothing too surprising here. This code should be pretty straightforward if you've taken our 172 class. Now, the part that might be a little interesting, though, is that when you search Xamarin Auth, you may run into the following error if you actually install 1311. Depending on when you're watching this video, we do have an installation conflict. So you may run into an error like I will right here. If that happens, if you're having this issue, there might be a newer component by the time you watch this video. If you run into this, that's okay. Just go get 131. Let's step back a version. And there we go. Now we're okay. And now we can start doing our Xamarin Auth code. So let us first create our Authenticator. Going to want a using here. All right, now let's start adding the appropriate parameters here. So a client ID. Let's remember the client ID has to be something that the server will accept. So let's go see what we configured at our server as a valid client ID. So we want in our startup.auth, and down there in our configure clients, client ID is just iOS. So when we give client ID iOS, it'll know who we are. Our next parameter is going to be the scope. We also had that scope configured in here as site access. So let's add that. We're asking for the permission of site access, or the right to access the scope of site access. The URL that I need to connect to, this will actually be a URL on my authorization server. So I need to connect to my authorization server. So first of all, let's remember once again that we are going to be running this on our mobile device or mobile simulator that will be running on my Mac. I'm on my Windows machine right now. Even though it looks like I'm going to be running my simulator locally, it's really running on the Mac, which means I'm not going to be able to use localhost or anything like that. So let's go ahead and, once again, even though I'm pointing at the same machine, I'm going to need my IP address. So it's going to be starting with that. And then it will be website with securities. And then, remember we made our authorization path /auth. Now the rest of this you just need to know from the identity server documentation, and the rest will be connect /authorize. Let's pretty up our parameters here a little bit, put them on separate lines, and keep going. Our next parameter is just going to be our redirect URL. In other words, we told the server to redirect to Xamarin.com once it's done. Now, what we want to do here on my mobile side is start watching to see when does the server redirect me to Xamarin.com. And when the server redirects me to Xamarin.com, that's when I'm going to figure I'm done. That's when Xamarin Auth will go, oh, okay, we're actually done here. And of course, that's actually a URI, so I actually do need to give it the URI constructor, because otherwise it's not going to actually match the parameter type. Okay, so let's set up what we want to have happen once we actually successfully complete. And all we're going to have it do for the moment is just output to that label. We're going to get that in the account properties. That's where we're going to go looking for our access token for right now. So let's just spit that out. The account is what Xamarin Auth sets up if we want to be using more of the trappings of Xamarin Auth, which we actually will be doing shortly. But right now, we just need access to the access token. We just need to make sure we're actually getting an access token that we can use to authenticate to our web API. Well, that's not going to work without those. Let's also trap for the error condition. And now it's time to actually present this to the user. Now remember, what we're doing is getting a web view, and then the web view is going to be presented to the user, navigated to show content from our authorization server. That way, our user is actually interacting with the authorization server and getting authenticated there and logging in there to the users that are configured there at that website. But then we're going to be able to get the access token back so that we can still act on behalf of the user. So let's get that web view and present it. Of course, we're going to animate it, but we don't need a completion handler. Now, on iOS, we actually won't get this window closed for us, that view controller that we're presenting right here. It actually does close it for us once we have that completed event on Android, but it doesn't on iOS. And so we're going to rearrange things here just a little bit. We're going to put that on top. And then we're going to allow my completed then to use that Auth GUI as well. And then we can dismiss view controller. And just to be technically correct, let's go ahead and dispose of that as well. Now let's set our startup projects and give ourselves a test run. click our button, there's our web view. And what we're seeing here is actually the problem that my IP address has changed. So here's the problem with hard coding IP addresses. So let's go ahead and fix that and try again. Do stuff again. There's my login screen inside my web view, inside my authorization server. Let's go ahead and log in. We created this account earlier on our website, and now we can log in to our mobile device with it. And we're asking, do we want to give this mobile access? And we're asking, do we want to give this iOS securities project site access? So here is our client ID. So our authorization server is saying, is it okay if this client, iOS securities, gets this rights to my test@tester account? And I'm saying yes, that's fine. There is our access token, nice and fresh from our authorization server and representing the user test@tester.com and all of that user's roles. All right, now that we've got a token, we're on to the next phase. The next phase is going to be having our API require that token. In other words, having our API refuse any requests that are not authenticated against our website. So our web API needs to be able to look at that token and determine if this person authenticated with the website first. We actually do have a Nuget package from Identity Server that's going to help us figure that out. And there's a couple different ways we can actually go about this. One of those is to have our token be something called a reference token. And if we have a reference token, we're actually going to take that token and our web API will, behind the scenes, in a back channel, it will go back to the website and say, hey, is this token valid? Okay, so obviously this has some benefits, but it also has the downside of requiring some additional HTTP chatter on a back channel, which could add to our latency. Alternatively, we could also have something called a JWT token, and this would be where our website would issue a token that actually encrypts all of the necessary information right into the token. Okay, and in that case, what our web API would do is actually just use the public key from the website, and then it will unencrypt or decrypt the token and get the information directly out of there. Okay, so we have both options, and those could be set up in our website when we're setting up our identity server options. We can set that up right there. And the web API can actually deal with either situation pretty well. So what we're going to need to do to get web API working, the first thing we'll actually have to do is get ourselves that pipeline in the web API. Now, depending on how you're setting things up, maybe you're using ASP.NET Core, and if you are, then you might already have a pipeline already set up in your web API, and that's great. In my case, I'm actually going to have to get that working. So let me go and manage Nuget packages here and start adding a couple. So the first thing I'm going to add is Owen itself. So this will give me the pipeline. And in fact, we're going to want Web API Owen. This will add all the other things that we need to work with, including the Owen base and system web and all that good stuff. Okay, so now let's actually back off of Nuget for a little while. We'll have to go back to it. But now I'm going to add a startup class. So just like we had in the website, that one was added by default. This one I'll actually have to add myself. I'm going to add just a class. and we'll just call it startup. Okay, the first thing I'm going to need to do here is to add my assembly attribute, Owen startup, that tells the Owen pipeline system, hey, run this when you start up. Let's get our using in there. Okay, and then in the startup class, I'm just going to need a method called configuration. And by convention, the Owen system knows to call this. One more using. Okay, so now back to Nuget. And now we're going to get the identity server stuff that we need. We actually only need a small subcomponent here, our access token validation. There it is. So we don't need the entire identity server because, well, this isn't an identity server. This is actually kind of an identity client, if you want to think about it that way. This is the client of Identity Server 3. Now, bear in mind, everything that's going on with our token validation, whether it's a JWT token or a reference token, this is all standards-based stuff. So you don't actually need the Identity Server 3 component here. If you wanted to write the code to go and look at the token, to go and get the public key and decrypt it, or you wanted to write the code to grab the reference token and then look at the authorization server and find its token validation endpoint and then submit that, you could do all that stuff. It's all standards based. We don't necessarily need the identity server client piece. However, let's face it, we don't want to write all that stuff, so we're going to, in this case, use the identity server client piece. It's going to make our lives a lot easier. Okay, back to our startup, and now inside of our configuration file, we can start referencing some of this identity server stuff. And just like in my website where there's use cookie authentication, and so that's the primary way for our website to be able to look at a logged in user, grab his cookie, figure out what the claims and identity of that user is. They use a cookie. Well, we use a token, right? Our web API here uses a token. So just like we had app.useCookieAuthentication in our website, here we'll have app.use identity server bearer token authentication. It's a bit of a mouthful. And create the options. Start setting up our options. Now, here is the most important part. This is the part where we say, what tokens do we accept? Right? Not just anyone can submit a token from anywhere. We accept tokens from specific authorization servers. And we also then will be able to go back to those authorization servers to validate the tokens. But not just any token from anywhere is okay. The authority that we will take is going to be our website / authorization server, which was going to be now, part of our specification with OpenID is something called a well-known endpoint. And so if you want to know any of the other paths associated with your authorization server, as soon as we have Identity Server plugged in, we can always actually go and check that out by opening a browser, going to our website, and then let's just browse to that authentication directory. All right, and here we'll see a link to the discovery document. So I'm in that /auth path off of my website. So /auth is my authorization server path, as we know. And then there's a link right here to discovery document. And this is actually this slash well-known slash OpenID configuration, this is actually a standard. And so we can just drop what we get right into any kind of a JSON parser, and we'll be able to see all the appropriate paths. So for instance, issuer here, I see the /auth, right? And I can see all of the other paths that are interesting right here. My authorized endpoint, right? We used that earlier, remember? We used that earlier. If we were using authorization code flow, we'd want to know about the token endpoint as well. So all of the interesting things, including, by the way, this is also where the public key can be grabbed from, is right here. So if we're going to be doing the decryption using the public key, we're going to be grabbing that from here as well. Again, we don't have to worry about that for the most part. For the most part, all of that stuff is going to be handled by our component. And so all we're doing then is aiming our API at our authorization server, which we did right here by providing the authority. And then the only other thing I'm going to say is, in order to log in with this particular web API, with this particular endpoint, we require the scopes of, you guys know, site access. And that's all we need for our configuration here. And now if we're sending a token, it's going to be handled because identity server bearer token authentication is now in the pipeline for my entire web API app. It's going to be handled, it's going to be decoded, and we're going to end up having a user. There will be a security principal on this request, on every request that comes in that sends a token. And so to make sure that's true, what we can do is in our customers controller over here, let's go ahead and re-add that authorized attribute that we commented out oh so long ago. And so now every /customers request must be authenticated or it will be refused. Okay, so now we've got that in place. Now we have to go back, of course, to our mobile app and make sure that it's passing the token. Because so far all we're doing with the token is just putting it in the output label. We actually need to pass that. So let's get ready to go do that, get back to our iOS app. So Xamarin Auth has a class called OAuth2 request, whose explicit purpose is to allow us to make HTTP requests and automatically pass the access token along. It actually will take the account that we got from our OAuth2 Authenticator, and it'll pull the access token right out of it and handle the access token for us. However, there's a little bit of a catch. It wants to handle the access token by putting it in the URL as a query string parameter. And that's not actually going to work with our OpenID Connect standard. So we could do this all manually with HTTP client and just handle all that ourselves. However, I do have for you a custom OAuth2 request object that will handle putting things in the header for us. So if you actually look at the infrastructure folder, you'll find that custom handler in there. So let's go ahead and include that for right now. There's our custom OAuth2 request. And if we take a look, we're going to see that the constructor actually in this one has an additional parameter, which is use header for token. Now it's going to default to false just for compliance with the actual original OAuth2 request. However, we can now set that to true. Let's go back to our Viewcontroller and start using an OAuth2 request, a custom OAuth2 request. So we're going to be changing the code we have in here quite a bit. We, of course, are still going to start with authenticating. So we're going to create our authenticator, get our GUI. However, now on completed, what do I want to have happen? Well, I'm going to be doing all of this as a single button press. I'm going to authenticate against the authorization server, and then I'm going to go ahead and use that token that I get to make a web API call. That's not always going to be how we handle things, but since it is how I'm handling things here, I actually would like to take advantage of async and await. With our callback model, that's not necessarily super easy here. However, we can go ahead and make that work. What I'm going to do now is create a task from a task completion source. So let's say auth task source. Now what this allows me to do is create a task that I can just sort of complete anytime I want without having to actually give it some specific code to run. So I've got the task completion source here. And now in my completed, that is when I know I've authenticated, what I can do is set the result. And when this happens, it will mean that my task has completed, that my task is done. And now I can await the task from the task completion source in other spots in code, which is exactly what we'll do here in just a second, because I also want to handle the error condition here. So now, after presenting our view controller, which will allow us to get authenticated, to be authenticated to the authorization server, after that, I can come down here and I can await that to happen. So my account now will await the auth task source dot actual task, which of course the awaiting will be completed once this code executes and completes that source. And that whole task is actually just defined with the task completion source up there. So we're now awaiting this to happen, basically. After presenting the view controller, we're awaiting the callback to execute, which will happen here, and then we can move on with the rest of our code. Now I'm actually going to declare this account outside here separately because we want this whole thing in a try block. Let's set the output text to tell us an error happened if, in fact, an error happened. And let's make sure we're always getting rid of that view controller, regardless of whether an exception happened or not, because we don't still need to be seeing it after the task is done, after the authorization task has completed. Let's just temporarily set our output text. And then finally, make our actual request here. First, no additional parameters. The account we want to grab the access token from. And we do, of course, want to use the header for the token. So there's everything we need for that. There we go. That'll fix that use of unassigned variable. And finally, our path. So once again, we're going to be using our IP address for this. Get the exact name here, website with securities. Oh, it's actually our web API this time, isn't it? We need our web API to call. All right, all that looks good. And so now we can await the response. So what do we want? We want the response as the rec.get response async, but this is actually going to return a response object. So we're actually going to then call from there get response text async from the response object. And so this whole thing then can actually be awaited again, like so, and get response text async from the response object. Looks a little awkward with the await, but it's a little more concise code than spreading it out on separate lines. So time to test everything again. We're going to have everything start up this time. go ahead and authenticate. Well, authorization has been denied for this request. So let's see what we can do about this. In fact, this is a sneaky one that can get us quite often when we end up adding the Owen startup ourselves instead of having the template do it for us. All we need to do is make sure we add the correct Nuget package. And there's one more that we need that didn't get added in and amongst all the other Owen packages that got added to our Web API startup. So what's happening is we added that startup, but this isn't running right now. To get our assembly Owen startup to run, we need, in addition to all the other Owen things that got added when I did add my Web API Owen infrastructure, I'm also going to need one more. And that one is the Microsoft Owen Host System Web. So let's go find that one. Okay, so now let's just give our IIS a full reset to make sure nothing is cached from our startup. So I'm just going to reset IIS here. Personally, I like to do it through the command line. You can always do it through the interface if you prefer. And then we'll do our start again. Click our button and do our login. There we are on our, hitting our customers endpoint, get customers. And there's our JSON.
So that's it for part 2. What I didn't show there at the end is that our authorized attribute can easily filter for specific users or roles as well. All those claims are included in the token, so obviously this is very, very powerful. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, folks. Bye for now.